Welcome and good morning. Thank you for joining us here at FBC Cafe. It's great to see you online. Thank you for joining us through YouTube and Facebook. Really lovely to see your names popping up. So do remember to say hi to us and speak back to us as well. And if you're new joining us online here at FBC, thank you. Really great to have you with us. I suppose what you've been going through is, like me, a bit of a weekend last week of first trips to cafes, first trips to pubs, things like that. Last week of homeschooling happening now, maybe last week's of school. Any holidays planned? Any camping trips? But really for me, it's been about the cafes and getting back to a little bit of normality gradually.
Yeah, and we're really excited to say that the FBC Cafe is going to be opening this week, Wednesday, 10 o'clock through till 4 o'clock. I think Monday through Saturday, the cafe is going to be open for takeaway only. There's a whole queuing system in place around the side of the building. So do come down and support the cafe and see a friendly face and say hello to people. That'd be great to do that.
That would be fantastic.
I'm so looking forward to having this place open again. We're going to have to move out of our studio, unfortunately, so next week we'll be somewhere else.
Won't still be here on Wednesday in this position.
We'll be somewhere
but the coffee is really good, so we might be.
Yeah, well, I will still be here. But do something else.
Yeah,
but
that's
you might be wondering about what's happening with FBC generally when some churches aren't meeting back in person now. When are we going to be gathering again? Well, we're working on that. We've got loads of stuff and we're thinking hard, coming up with plans and ideas for when we can regather again. We're wanting to do that at a place where we can do it safely, when we can do stuff well for kids and young people, and we can also create a good experience for all of us together. So if you're not tuned in with the stuff that's going on at FBC, if you're not receiving our updates, just go to fbcnext.com/subscribe and you can get the latest update, we send out weekly updates and stuff like that, information on what's going on. In the next week or so, we're going to send out some news about our plan for re-entry and reopening the building and all those sort of stuff. So please, if you're not tuning into those emails, make sure you do that.
Fantastic, yeah. And you're joining us this morning as we wrap up our series, Better For It. So let's dive in.
What would you do if you found yourself in a situation where you were standing in front of your enemy, your nemesis, but this time you had all the power? Perhaps they were a bully from school or a boss who made your life difficult. You're standing face to face. Last time you met, they had the opportunity to hurt you, and they took it. But now the tables have turned. You are stronger, wiser, and more powerful. You hold all the keys. Now, they say that revenge is a dish best served cold. You've had time to think about this moment. You've longed for this day when the tables would finally be turned in your favor. So what do you do? Well, this is the situation that Joseph finds himself in. For the last 2 weeks, we've been following along with Joseph's story. Here's a quick recap for you. Joseph was the son of Jacob. He had 11 brothers, and he was the favorite son. He lorded his favoritism over his brothers, and they hated him. I mean, really hated him. One day, his brothers had had enough. So they kidnapped him and sold him to some slave traders. Joseph finds himself working for a guy called Potiphar. Now, Potiphar's wife took a shine to Joseph. She wanted to sleep with him, but Joseph refused. So she kept on. She was persistent, but Joseph kept on turning her down. Eventually, she gets fed up and she's offended. So she accuses Joseph of trying to rape her. Potiphar has no option. He throws Joseph in prison. He's there because he refused to do the very thing that he's accused of doing. If he'd only given in to Potiphar's wife, he wouldn't be in this mess. Where's the justice in all that? Now, last week, Jamie shared with us how Joseph lived as if God was with him. But if God was with him, would he be in this mess? Where was his God when his brothers beat him and sold him to the traders? Where was his God when his master's wife accuses him of something he hadn't done? She was the one in the wrong, but he's the one in prison. Now, whilst Joseph was in prison, he used his gift of interpreting dreams. Pharaoh had thrown 2 of his servants into prison. They both had troubling dreams, and Joseph interpreted them for them. It's not good news for the baker. Joseph tells him that he's going to be executed. But the story is better for the cupbearer. Joseph tells him that he will be released, and sure enough, he is. Now, Joseph tells his story to the cupbearer, and he asks him to put in a good word for him to Pharaoh. Perhaps things are finally looking up for him. This is where we're going to pick up the story. The final verse of Genesis chapter 40 says this. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Now 2 years pass and Joseph is still in prison. Pharaoh has had a series of disturbing dreams, but no one can interpret them. Now we need to recognize that dreams in the ancient world were viewed differently to today. They were thought of as prophetic. Dreams had meanings. So if you had a series of disturbing dreams, you'd want to know what they meant. But nobody could tell Pharaoh. Finally, the cupbearer remembers Joseph. So he plucks up the courage to tell Pharaoh about him. He doesn't want to remind Pharaoh of what happened to cause him to get thrown into prison, but this might be a way of gaining favor with Pharaoh. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he'd shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. This is Joseph's chance. He can finally get out of prison. But Joseph says something unexpected that made the cupbearer look for the exit. This is what Joseph said. I cannot do it, he says. Now, what's he doing? The cupbearer is really panicking now. He recommended Joseph. He put his neck on the line for him, literally. If Joseph fails, it will look bad on him. Now, if we think saying, I can't do it to Pharaoh was bad, what comes next is so much worse. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Now, Pharaoh thought he was God. Joseph is basically telling Pharaoh to his face that he isn't all-powerful. He is telling him that there is a God who is bigger and stronger than him. People have been executed for far less. But it seems that Pharaoh is more intrigued than insulted. So he shares his dreams with Joseph, and Joseph interprets them. He tells Pharaoh that there will be 7 good years in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. That's what the dream means. But Joseph keeps talking. He begins to tell Pharaoh what he should do. Now, nobody tells Pharaoh what to do, but obviously no one's told Joseph that. Joseph suggests that during the 7 good years, that they store up the excess food to be used during the 7 bad years. And then Joseph suggests that Pharaoh should find someone wise to oversee the whole operation. How will Pharaoh respond to this? This is what it says. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to you, to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Wow, what a roller coaster. He's gone from being a favorite, arrogant son to slave to prisoner to prime minister. But the ride isn't over yet. The things happened as Joseph said they would. There were 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. The famine was so severe that it spread beyond Egypt. Now, Genesis chapter 42 brings a new twist to the story. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? I've heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. Now, Joseph is 40 years old. A lot of time has passed since he was sold as a slave by his brothers. He's about to meet them again. How will he respond? He has all the power now. He can do whatever he wants. So what will he do? Well, let's take a look. When Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. This is exactly what Joseph said would happen all those years ago when he shared his dream with them. Joseph recognized his brothers immediately, but they don't realize that they're before their brother Joseph. Now, what's going through Joseph's mind? How will he react? What will he do? What happens next is a bit strange. I think Joseph is trying to figure out how he should respond. I don't think he knows what he should do. For the next 3 chapters, this elaborate plot unfolds. We haven't got time to go into it here. You really should read it for yourself. It's fascinating. After a lot of back and forth, the brothers had found themselves in Joseph's house. But they still don't know that Joseph is Joseph. So Joseph is eating with his brothers. They're right in front of him. He has them right where he wants them. What goes through his mind at this point? What would go through yours? Perhaps he recalls the terror of being in that pit. The uncertainty of not knowing what would happen to him. The fear and panic as he's carried off by the traders, seeing his home disappear into the distance, and finding himself in a new and strange land. Perhaps he thinks about the time in prison and all of the injustice associated with that. Now, Genesis chapter 45 starts by telling us that Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants. And he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." Now, imagine what's going through his brothers' minds. They'd have been terrified. What's going to happen to them? Who is this madman before them who is acting so strangely? Joseph speaks. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. They were scared before, but now they are completely terrified. A moment ago, they thought that Joseph was just odd. Now they know why he's been acting so strangely. He's their younger brother who they hated and sold as a slave. Of course they're terrified, but they don't need to be terrified in his presence. You see, in their absence, Joseph had lived life as if God was present. This gave Joseph the ability to not react, but to respond. A reaction would have been to kill or imprison his brothers forever. I'm sure that crossed his mind. But instead, he chooses to forgive them. When he's in the place of power, when his time has come, when he could finally get revenge, he chooses to forgive. Now, this wasn't easy. As we read the events that took place, we see that Joseph struggled with this. I'm sure there were moments when he came close to ending them, but he didn't. He chose not to react, but to respond. When we react, we do what we want to do in the moment, but we often end up regretting it in the future. However, when we respond, we take time to pause and consider what we should do before we act. Where have you reacted instead of responded over the last few months? In difficult and stressful times, it can be so much harder to respond. We are more prone to react. Perhaps it's saying something unkind or harsh to a loved one. Maybe it's firing off an email before you have taken time to consider what you should say. Do you need a pop-up on your email account that says, "Do you really want to send this?" Perhaps you found yourself on the other end of someone reacting rather than responding. What do you do in that moment? Now, the temptation is to react back, to act in the same way that they are. But all that happens in moments like this is that people get hurt and relationships get destroyed. It might feel good for a moment, but we are left with regret and more pain. And the problem that caused us to react in the first place is still there. We still have to deal with it, but now we have to deal with a broken relationship too. So Joseph doesn't react. He responds, and he says something to his brothers that couldn't have been easy, but it was life and world changing. Joseph says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." That is a response. That's not a reaction. How was it possible for Joseph to respond in this way? How could he say something like this? How could he forgive and start to forget all that had happened? How could he let them off the hook when he had them right where he wanted them? God. Only God. Joseph lived his life as if God was with him, because God was with him. Throughout it all, God was with him. God isn't just there when life is good and absent when life is bad. He is there. He's always there. And in all situations, he's at work helping us to be better for it. Joseph was better for it. And so the beginning of the nation of Israel was set. Each of these brothers would become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel, from whom the Messiah would later come, who would do for the entire world what Joseph did for his brothers: forgive. So how do we become better for it when we find ourselves in a place where we didn't intend to be? Well, by learning to respond rather than react. And how do we do that when everything in us wants to react rather than respond? By choosing to live in the confidence that comes from knowing that God is with you throughout it all. You know, there's a part of me that really wants to react. There's a part of me that wants to hurt those who have hurt me or the people I love. There's a part of me that wants to get even. But that isn't all of me. God is with me, and he is bigger than me. God wants me to be able to respond, to learn, to grow. God wants me to be better for it, whatever it is. Please know that your current circumstances are not the whole story. They're just the current chapter. How you respond determines the shape of the next chapter. If you're anything like me, you will need God's help to enable you to respond and not just react. When we respond, we give room to God to bring out the good from the bad situation. This good is for our good and the good of the people around us. It's even good for those who may have intended to harm us. And that's why we need God to help us. I need his help to get myself out of the way so I can respond in a way that is good for me and is also good for those who have hurt me. We can only do this by living our lives as if God is with us. The good news is, he is. So how...
Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this morning, and that even in these unusual times, we can join together as a community in different ways to learn more about you. Thank you for the work being done by FBC beyond the building, the time and gifts being given, the new connections being made. Thank you that you can make the old brand new, that you're with each and every one of us and love us with your unfailing love, even when we feel unloved or unlovable. Please be close to us in the week ahead, Lord, and help us to pause, to respond rather than react. Lord, in your name, amen.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, we're coming to the end of our time together on FBC Live, but we're going to carry the conversation a little bit later. Sarah and I are going to carry on the conversation, just chatting through some of the stuff that we've been talking about, and we'd love for you to join in with that. Next week, we're starting a brand new series that's going to run us right to the end of August, called Search. And we're going to just be exploring some of the big questions of life and faith, and looking at, well, what does Jesus have to say about that? How does he speak into some of those things? Now, if there's something specific that you'd like us to look at over that series, just drop us a message, stick it in the chat here, contact us on social media, drop us an email, or go to fbcnext.com and find the contact us page. And we'd love to look at some of the stuff that actually you would like to search for answers for, some of those big things that you're facing in life and faith at the moment. But that's the end for FBC Live of this part of the programme. We're going to carry on the conversation. Hope you can stick with us. Wherever you are, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, you can just stay where you are, and we're going to carry on.
Great. Great, so we're going to move on now to some questions, aren't we, that have been from the service. Thank you for staying with us. We have some questions here. Do comment so that you can kind of respond with us as well, and we can react there. Respond rather than react. Where are the moments, the questions I'm just going to read to you now. Okay, you can see them up on the screen as well, so we can pause and reflect. Where are the moments in your life where it looks like God has abandoned you? In what situations do you find it more difficult to respond than react? And what impact do you think your current responses will have on your future story? Really challenging questions there, Chris.
Yeah.
I think you should answer one of them first, because there's some really tough ones to wrestle with, aren't they? So where are the moments in your life then that you found kind of God looks like he's abandoned you?
Yeah, well, I can talk to that. If you've got experiences and situations in your life, please put them in the chat, share them with us. If you've got questions about this sort of stuff as well, put them in there, and we'd love to talk to that.
That would be great.
We've talked about this quite a lot during this whole time, because the whole suffering thing has really come to the fore over the last 3 months. It's been on our mind. I mean, it's always on our mind, but it's sort of become a lot more evident as we look at what's going on in the world and what's going on in our communities and in our families. And as I look back over my life, I can see there's moments when, looking in from the outside, it can appear that God has left me, that God has abandoned me. The whole point in the Joseph story is that Joseph was in prison. He was sold as a slave by his brothers. He was put in prison for something he didn't do. And his best mate was a prison warden. And if your best mate is a prison warden, it doesn't seem that God is really there with you, does it, in that situation? If you find yourself in all those places. But Joseph lived his life like God was with him, because God was with him. And I see that in my life as well, that in those dark moments of life, when things seem to fall apart and work can be difficult, or family can be stressful, or people you care about get sick, finances can be stretched, all of those things, when you're looking in, it can seem like God has abandoned you. But I know for me, in the midst of those situations, actually, that's where I become aware of God's presence, that God really steps up for me. There's that really famous poem, the Footprints poem. Most people might have come across it. Just Google it if you're not sure of what it is. Just type Footprints.
Footprints in the sand, isn't it? Quite often it's yeah.
Yeah, and the whole thing is this person reflecting back on their life and seeing these two sets of footprints throughout their life. And one was God and one was theirs. And then they saw there was these moments where there was just one set of footprints. And those one set of footprints just represented the times when life was difficult.
Yeah.
And this person said, well, God, why did you leave me during those difficult times? When life was difficult and life was challenging, why did you leave me and abandon me in those moments? And God responds, I didn't leave you at those times. That's where I carried you.
Yeah.
Which is just a lovely, sentiment, a lovely, lovely picture, lovely poem. But actually, I've seen that to be true in my life. That in those moments when actually it has been difficult and it's been challenging, God carries me through those. So I can't see times when God's abandoned me, but I can see lots of places where, looking in from the outside, it seems that you looking at someone else, you might think, well, where is God in those situations? So I understand why people can feel like that and think that.
Yeah, I definitely feel like that. I think if people were looking in on my life, especially through lockdown, I really did need to be carried and picked up and cuddled at moments, and held and walked. And I felt really far from God quite a lot and did feel quite abandoned because there's this intense pressure of all the juggle, everything that's going on. You're like, oh, it's work and it's life and it's family and I can't do any of them well, and you get exhausted and angry. So I do sort of feel there are moments, certainly the last few months has been massively challenging, sort of the parenting, desperately trying to be a good parent, homeschooling, but no respite because the usual sort of parents and school and things like that just aren't there. So I think when the balance is gone, it can certainly feel like God's abandoned you. But for me, the other thing that lockdown's given me is that quieter time and that reflection. I mean, I've started reading again, or I've started, being able to sort of take a step back and not just be chock-a-block with other things sometimes. And it's those moments where you have that reflection maybe and don't feel so abandoned. But yeah, I think certainly someone looking in, I think, some of the most exasperating and difficult moments.
Yeah, and I think in places like that, there's lots of coincidences, I can't say that word, coincidences start to happen. That you pray and God does little things which actually have a big impact. And I've got a trivial example. Many years ago, around about Christmas time, our boiler broke in our house and it was freezing cold. So this a plumber came out, a gas engineer came out and fixed it and all this sort of stuff, and he was just chatting with us, asking what I do. I said, well, I'm a minister of a church. And his response was, well, that's, God didn't really help you there, did he?
Where was God there?
Where was God there? Because, your boiler's been fixed. He was working on someone else's boiler and actually came out for an emergency call out. And I said to him, well, look, you're here, aren't you?
Yeah.
God is here, as in because God's at work because he's brought you to fix our boiler. So the problem has been solved. So,
yeah, and it's not always the way that we would have solved it or have thought it might be solved. So I think that's really, So, and in which situations do you kind of find yourself, because, if you find it more difficult to respond than react? I mean, because obviously a lot of us are channeled, aren't we, to sort of just react and kind of quickly have a response. Do you find it really difficult sometimes?
I so find it difficult. My natural tendency is to react and not to respond. And the flashpoints for me, family, with kids. But that's a real.
It's not just you, Chris.
Yeah,
it's not just you, Chris. We're just going to leave it a little bit there, just so that doubt could form. But it's not just you, Chris.
I was worried.
That's all of us.
But I also find myself reacting. If people treat people in a way that's just not kind, when there's lack of patience or gentleness. Certainly, if people say stuff to me and they've not really think about how it comes across. My tendency is to want to react and to lash out. My tendency is to want to respond to that short email that's landed in and someone's not really thought about the tone or the message. And that's why email's not a great form of communication, is it? Because you can't pick up those nuances. So you can interpret it in that way. But my tendency there is to want to just react against that. And it takes everything within me to pull back and think, okay, let's just pause, take a deep breath and find out how do I have a measured response to that situation. And again, the story that we looked at, Joseph, you see that he was in the position of power where he could get his own back on his brothers.
Yeah.
He could actually do something to them. He could hurt them. He could throw them in prison. He could execute them, and nobody would have batted an eyelid at him. And you see this tension. If you're not familiar with the story, I really encourage you to go and read it towards the end of Genesis. It's amazing the stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
And you see the battle within him. He sees his brothers and thinking, well, and I'm sure all of that feeling, all of that emotion, all of that injustice came into him, and I think he wanted to react. I think he wanted to get his own back.
Do you think he was fighting against that? Because I think you kind of see that kind of like, what should I do here? What should I be? And so he was wrestling with that a bit.
Definitely, I think that's a really big thing within him, and thinking about that. But as we see, he's able to overcome that temptation to react. He's able to pause long enough or wrestle with it long enough to get to a point where he's able to respond. Yeah. And actually that changes stuff for him.
That really resonates with me because I'm such a fan of the quick quip or the jumping in or saying something smart, and that becomes really ugly in a row. So I'll react and I'll think of what can I do to shut this down or say something, and that's such a react response, isn't it? And I think the moments, and I think they're still few and far between, especially through lockdown. And thank you, Helen, for agreeing with me there that it's been so hard during lockdown to not kind of go to react responses and to not kind of it's been so hard to be a good version of yourself sometimes in those situations. So I think that kind of pause response has sometimes just not been there as much as it might have been before, because it's that kind of like, everything is just building up and so much sometimes. So it's really interesting to hear that described, and reassuring, Chris, that you struggle with it too. So
that's good.
Great.
But what about you? If you're watching this, where are the places that you find it more natural to react rather than respond? Where do you struggle to find a measured response? Where are the things that pushes your buttons and actually makes you react? Just put that in the chat or the comments. Obviously, the things that you can share in that place. We'd love to hear that as well.
And the third question, if we move to that then a bit as well, what impact do you think your current responses will have on your future story, Chris? Because we've been thinking about this, and obviously that could be a negative or a positive kind of outcome. What do you think that question leads to? What impact do responses have?
The whole concept of the series is how can we be better for it? So we're in a crisis and things are going not as we planned. We wouldn't have choose this. We wouldn't have picked this. But it doesn't mean that because of this we can't be stronger. It doesn't mean that because of all that we've gone through and all that we will continue to go through, because we're not at the end yet, it doesn't mean that we can't be better for it. And this is where this question really comes into the fore, because how we respond in this situation, how we respond to one another, how we respond at work, how we respond to our communities, to our neighbours, to the world around us, will actually have an impact on our future story. So thinking about that and trying to think, well, I don't want to react, or I'm not going to react. I don't think any of us really want to react to a certain extent. There's something that feels good in the moment when you lash out at somebody or react in that way, but then quickly the damage is there and we regret that. So most of us would rather be able to have a measured response. Actually making that choice and thinking, how do I do that in a way that is going to set me up and set my family up and set my community up into the future is really important. And again, this is a big motif throughout Joseph's story. We see that he found himself in that situation that I just mentioned, and he could react, and he wanted to react, I'm sure, as we just said. But he chooses to respond. And the ending of the story is absolutely amazing. His whole family are gathered to him. They come to Egypt. This is the fulfillment of the dream, the prophecies that he had right at the beginning of the story, where he dreamt that basically that his whole family would bow down to him. And they bow down to him. But it's very different.
We're all seeing Joseph in his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat here now. With we're all going back to that minute we saw it on stage, or we sang in it, and the familiar song. But who would have thought that would be the culmination? I mean, that's what makes it such a great show as well to watch, doesn't it? But it's that story, the culmination of all the family coming back together.
Yeah, it's an amazing image. But I think as Joseph shared that right at the beginning of the story, and as his brothers listened to it, what they were expecting, or what Joseph was expecting, was him with a position of power and them all like worshipping him and this sort of stuff. And that's almost the case, but the humility that we see in Joseph's heart at the end of the story wasn't there at the beginning. And why is it there now? Well, it's because he chooses to respond in all of the later tragedies that happen to him, as he's sold as a slave, as he's falsely imprisoned, as he's stuck there for 2 years, as he sees his brothers and he has the chance to get revenge. He chooses to respond as if God was with him, because God was with him. And it finds himself in this situation where he's able to say to his brothers, now this is absolutely amazing that he can do this. He said to them, don't be afraid, don't be worried. I know that you meant this for my harm, but God meant it for good. And that good's been accomplished now, the saving of many lives. Now, my word, that's perspective, isn't it? That Joseph was able to do that. And how was he able to do it? Yeah. Well, it's because God was with him. You know, it's not because he had this superpower that what people said or what people did to him didn't affect him. Of course it affected him. But he chose to lean into the presence of God for him. And actually the result was the saving of many lives. And as we fast forward, we see actually that through that, the nation of Israel are established. The 12 brothers, you know, Joseph and his brothers become the 12 heads of the tribes of Israel. And from them comes the Messiah, comes Jesus, who will do for the whole world what Joseph did for his brothers. Forgive them. And that's whole part of this whole thing. And that's what I'm talking about how we respond now will influence our future story. So the things, how we treat our kids, how we respond at work, what we do as a church and how we open and how we do that in a way that's safe and all those sort of things, how we start to regather or reopen the building, will have a massive impact on our future story. And I know that can be a little bit pressured because you think, well, if I get it wrong, will I mess up my kids, and will I mess up my relationships, and will I mess up my work? And there is a danger. I mean, you look at lots of people's stories where it goes wrong, and it's often because of a reaction, because of an opportunity to respond that wasn't taken. And I don't say that to put guilt or to put pressure onto us, but to help us soberly remind ourselves that this is a big part of life, and if we want to get it right, if we want to be better for it, well, I don't want to rely on myself. I don't want to look to my wisdom or my knowledge or my skills or my ability. I want to rely on somebody far greater than me.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, Chris, because I mean, this is all very well, but I can hear myself, like, you know, my first response is not to say, oh, thank you, darling, for this opportunity to respond. You know, that is not within my vocabulary right now. How do we do this? What would you, I mean, you said about this moment to pause, you know, kind of what are we really talking about there? Because this is really a kind of, how does my best self, how do I respond with God right next to me moment, isn't it? So kind of you're building that into your life, you're kind of taking the time out almost for yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a great question. Actually, next week, as we're starting this new series called Search, the question that we're asking ourselves is, how can I feel refreshed in a world that's stressing me out? And actually, so the stuff we're going to talk about next week, we'll speak into that. And it's about that very thing, you know, establishing healthy rhythms of life, acknowledging that God is with us and looking to Him to be a source of comfort, a source of strength, making right choices, and doing that on a day-by-day basis, because it's not a once-off decision and that's it, we're all sorted. For me, I have to consciously, I can't say that word either, choose.
So we're going to work on coincidence and consciously.
It's something to do with, anyway. I have to do that word to put myself in a position where I'm willing to listen to God and allow myself to be led by God. And that takes time and it takes practice. It's not a science, but the more I do that, the more I become aware of God at work in me and God at work around me and in people around me. And I'm able to respond better than react.
Oh, we've got Helen Valler. Thank you, Helen, for commenting. She says, the times that I can respond best have been after I've paused and offloaded my hurts and negative feelings onto God. So that's the kind of, you know, that's what I was talking about. How do you channel that? Because, you know, how do you kind of go, right, okay, so it's taking the moment and kind of, and then reflecting and pausing.
And just imagine you did that. You know, whenever you're in a situation where you want to react, so somebody's said something or somebody's done something or whatever, and you're wanting to react, and instead of reacting, you do what Helen's saying, you take time and you pause, and you offload that, you verbalize that to God, you know, this is what I'm feeling, they've said this, and don't they care, and all that sort of stuff, and this is what it's making me feel, and we actually offload that to God, all of that negative feelings, and then we respond. You know, I know if I've done that
Yeah.
throughout my past, some of the damages that I've caused myself or caused other people, I wouldn't have caused. Some of the times when I've flown off the handle to my kids, which I'm hoping they're not watching at the moment.
Hi.
I wouldn't have done.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have reacted in that way. I would have been able to respond in a better way.
Did you get that? That was Daddy saying sorry. That's great. But yeah, no, I think so. I think especially, and I think it's probably been exacerbated with lockdown as well, because we're in this world of likes and respond receipts and kind of, WhatsApp back and kind of, making sure you kind of almost, speed is almost valued so much in that, isn't it? So the react is really kind of, you just get the gut instinct, you don't get the reflect and the kind of, actually, this is what I really wanted to say. And maybe a kind of more considered response rather than the kind of quick shout back or the moment of trying to be clever or trying to, win the argument. So yeah, I think that's really valuable.
Yeah. So that's what I hope for you and for us this week, that whatever it is that you're going to face over the coming days, that when you find yourself in that situation where you want to react, when you want to lash out, and where you want to treat them the way that they treated you, I hope that you have that opportunity to pause and to find a way to respond in a way that's going to be better for you and going to be better for the people around you. Because when we do that, we truly can be better for it. Well, we're going to wrap up our conversation this morning. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us. It's been lovely.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining us online as well through Facebook and YouTube. It's been great to be here with you, Chris. Thank you.
It's great. Have a great week, everyone.